By the time of European arrival, the dominant indigenous group inhabiting the Los Angeles basin was the Tongva, speakers of a Uto-Aztecan language. Their society was organized into a network of approximately 50 to 100 autonomous villages, each politically independent but linked through kinship, trade, and ceremonial ties. The village of Yanga, situated near the Los Angeles River in what is now the Civic Center, was one of the largest and most influential of these communities. Political authority within each village was vested in a Tongva, or chief, a hereditary position typically passed down through a specific lineage. The Tongva's power was not absolute. It derived from wealth, social standing, and the ability to build consensus. The social structure was further stratified by a class of elites, commoners, and a small number of captives or slaves. Kinship was the fundamental organizing principle, with lineages, often matrilineal, dictating social obligations and marriage patterns. The Tongva economy was sophisticated and diverse. A complex trade network connected coastal villages with those on the Channel Islands and in the inland valleys. The primary form of currency was shell bead money, meticulously crafted from olivella shells. This facilitated the exchange of goods such as steatite bowls and carving stones from Catalina Island for acorns, seeds, and animal hides from the mainland. Their material culture was highly adapted to the local environment. They constructed dome-shaped homes called kio from willow poles thatched with tule reeds. A key technological achievement was the tiat, a sewn plank canoe sealed with natural asphaltum, or tar. This advanced watercraft enabled deep-sea fishing for tuna and swordfish and facilitated trade with the island populations. The Tongva cosmology was intricate, viewing the world as sacred and populated by powerful spiritual forces. Their creation story centered on the figure of Kwao, a non-gendered creator who sang the world and its first gods into existence from a state of primordial chaos. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Another central figure was Wyatt, a divine ruler whose death brought mortality to humanity. This belief system was later influenced by the Chinig Chinich religion, a more dogmatic and moralizing spiritual system that spread northward from the Luiseno people. Religious life was guided by the Jait, or shaman, who served as a healer, spiritual advisor, and conductor of ceremonies. These rituals, often including hallucinogenic plants like datura, were performed to mark seasonal changes, commemorate life events, and maintain balance with the spiritual world. The Yovar, or sweat house, was a central feature of village life for men, used for both ritual purification and social congregation. Thus, the Tongva were not a simple hunter-gatherer society, but a complex civilization with established political structures, a robust economy, and a profound spiritual worldview, deeply integrated into the landscape they inhabited. The pre-colonial landscape of the Los Angeles basin was not a pristine wilderness, but a meticulously managed environment shaped by millennia of indigenous intervention. The concept of an ecology of abundance arises not from passive foraging but from active and sophisticated resource management, a form of proto-agriculture that enhanced the productivity of native flora and fauna. The most significant tool in this management system was anthropogenic fire. Indigenous populations practiced controlled burning on a regular basis to achieve specific ecological outcomes. These low-intensity fires cleared out dense, impassable chaparral, promoting the growth of fire-adapted seed-bearing annuals and perennial grasses that were crucial for sustenance and basketry materials. Burning also created a mosaic of habitats, increasing the edge effect that attracted game animals like deer and quail, making them easier to hunt. This pyrotechnic horticulture prevented the buildup of fuel that leads to catastrophic wildfires, maintaining a landscape that was both more productive and more resilient. Beyond fire, direct plant husbandry was widespread. Ethnobotanical and archaeological evidence indicates that communities actively tended to specific plant resources. They used digging sticks to till the soil around valuable plants, pruned woody shrubs like elderberry and manzanita to increase fruit yields, and selectively harvested seeds to ensure future growth. Groves of oak trees, the source of the critical acorn staple, were carefully managed through clearing of competing undergrowth and protection from pests. This level of cultivation challenges the simplistic classification of these societies as mere hunter-gatherers, suggesting instead a deep, symbiotic relationship with the plant world. The material culture was directly tied to this managed ecology. Basketry, a highly developed art form, required a consistent supply of specific grasses, reeds, and willow shoots, the quality and quantity of which were maintained through regular burning and pruning. The use of natural resources was comprehensive. Asphaltum, seeping from the La Brea pits and other locations, was used not only for waterproofing watercraft, but also for sealing baskets, hafting projectile points, and as a general adhesive. This system created regional specialization that drove economic interdependence. Coastal communities focused on the rich marine biome, while inland groups managed terrestrial resources. The resulting surplus, a direct product of this active landscape management, fueled the extensive trade networks that linked the entire region. The natural abundance that the first European explorers documented was, in fact, the product of a human-modified ecosystem, a testament to a profound and sustained interaction between a people and their environment. The first European land entry into the Los Angeles basin was a direct consequence of Spanish imperial policy, specifically the strategic initiative known as the Sacred Expedition. Instigated by José de Galvez, the Visitor General of New Spain, this multi-pronged land and sea operation was a defensive maneuver designed to establish a Spanish presence in Alta California and preempt Russian colonial expansion southward from Alaska. The Overland Party, commanded by Captain Gaspar de Portola, governor of Las Californias, departed from San Diego in July 1769 with the primary objective of locating the harbor of Monterey, described in earlier maritime accounts. The expedition was a logistical undertaking comprising 64 men, including soldiers from the Presidio of Loreto, Catalonian volunteers, Baja Californian Christian Indians who served as laborers, and Franciscan missionaries. The critical chroniclers of this journey were Fray Juan Crespi, whose detailed diary provides the most extensive ethnographic and geographic record, and Miguel Costanzo, the military engineer and cartographer. On August 2, 1769, after crossing the San Gabriel River, the expedition reached the banks of a more substantial river. Crespi, adhering to ecclesiastical custom, named it El Rio de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles de Porciuncula, in honor of the feast day of the Porciuncula Indulgence. His diary entry for that day documents the encounter with a large settled village, which was Yanga. He recorded the hospitality of the inhabitants, noting they offered gifts of seeds, acorn meal, and shell beads. Crespi's assessment of the location was overwhelmingly positive, describing a spacious valley, well grown with cottonwoods and alders, among which ran a beautiful river. He remarked on its potential for a large settlement, citing the abundance of water, fertile soil, and available timber. This initial encounter was largely peaceful, characterized by cautious diplomacy and trade. Costanzo's technical report corroborated Crespi's observations, emphasizing the site's strategic value and its suitability for agriculture and irrigation. The expedition did not linger. After a brief stay, they continued their northward search for Monterey. However, the detailed records kept by Crespi and Costanzo constituted the first written European description of the Los Angeles region. Their positive assessment of the area's resources directly influenced the subsequent decision by Spanish authorities to establish a mission and, later, a civilian pueblo in the valley, marking the definitive beginning of the region's colonial history. The establishment of Mission San Gabriel Arcangel on September 8, 1771, marked the formal imposition of Spanish colonial power in the Los Angeles basin. Founded by Franciscan fathers Pedro Cambon and Angel Samara, the mission was initially situated on the banks of the Rio Hondo, a location chosen for its proximity to large Tongva villages and its agricultural potential. This institution was the fourth in the Alta California chain and was designed to be a center for religious conversion and economic production. The core objective was the transformation of the indigenous population into gente de razón Christianized, Spanish-speaking subjects. This process began with baptism, which legally placed the neophyte under the mission's jurisdiction, severing their ties to their former communities and obligating them to a new life of labor and religious observance. The mission system introduced a radical new economic order based on intensive European-style agriculture and animal husbandry. The Franciscans brought non-native species that irrevocably altered the local ecology, including wheat, barley, corn, wine grapes, and vast herds of cattle, sheep, and horses. The entire economic enterprise was dependent upon a coercive labor system. The Tongva neophytes became the mission's workforce, subjected to a highly regimented daily schedule dictated by the ringing of church bells. Their labor built the mission complex, tilled the fields, tended the livestock, and produced goods ranging from woven textiles and leather products to soap and candles. This system effectively dismantled the indigenous economy, replacing a managed foraging system with sedentary agricultural servitude. Resistance to this new order was immediate and violent. Within a month of its founding, a conflict erupted, precipitated by the sexual assault of a Tongva woman by a Spanish soldier. A group of Tongva warriors led by the woman's husband attacked the mission, resulting in the chief's death and the display of his head on a pole as a warning. This event underscores the violent coercion that underpinned the mission's establishment. Despite this resistance, the mission grew rapidly, becoming the most agriculturally productive and wealthy in the entire Alta California chain. Its success in generating surplus goods established a permanent economic anchor for the Spanish in the region, fundamentally and permanently altering the social, spiritual, and economic landscape for the indigenous peoples. The founding of El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Angeles on September 4, 1781, was a calculated act of civil colonization, distinct in purpose from the region's religious missions and military presidios. The establishment was mandated by Governor Felipe de Neve under the authority of the Reglamento para el Gobierno de la Provincia de Californias of 1779. This new regulation was a strategic plan to strengthen Spanish dominion over Alta California by creating self-sufficient agricultural towns that could produce grain and other foodstuffs for the military garrisons, thereby reducing the costly and unreliable maritime supply lines from San Blas, Mexico. The colonists, known as pobladores, were not wealthy Spanish settlers, but were recruited from the impoverished northern provinces of Sonora and Sinaloa. The initial party consisted of 11 families, a total of 44 individuals. A detailed 1,781 census reveals the profoundly multiracial and caste-based composition of this founding group. Of the 22 adults, only 2 identified as Spanish, Español. The majority were of mixed ancestry, including individuals classified as Indio, Negro, Mulatto, and Mestizo, reflecting the complex demographics of northern New Spain. More than half the founding population had African ancestry. The official founding involved a procession from the San Gabriel mission to the selected site near the river, a location chosen for its access to water for irrigation. Upon arrival, each family was formally granted a tract of land. This allocation consisted of a sola, a residential plot in the town grid, and 4 suertes, planting fields located outside the central plaza. To ensure their success, the Spanish crown provided each family with livestock, farming implements, seeds, and modest financial subsidies, all of which were considered a loan to be repaid to the royal treasury from future harvests. The first and most critical public works project was the construction of the Zanja Madre, or Mother Ditch, an irrigation canal that diverted water from the river to the Pueblo lands, making agriculture viable. The Pueblo was established with a civil government, separate from the authority of the mission friars or the presidio commander, consisting of an alcalde, mayor, and a small council, the ayuntamiento. This secular foundation created a new locus of non-clerical, non-military power in the region. Life in the early Los Angeles pueblo was defined by subsistence agriculture, social stratification, and a complex interdependence between its diverse inhabitants. The society was a three-tiered hierarchy. At the base were the Tongva, both neophytes from the San Gabriel mission and non-missionized individuals, who constituted the primary labor force. The pobladores, or civilian settlers, occupied the middle stratum, while the soldados de cura, the leather jacket soldiers, and their families held a higher social standing. Daily existence for the pobladores revolved around the cultivation of their assigned suertes. The primary crops were corn, beans, and wheat, essential for both their own survival and for fulfilling their contractual obligation to supply the Santa Barbara and San Diego presidios. Communal labor was a necessity, particularly for the maintenance of the vital Zanja Madre, which was prone to flooding and required constant upkeep. The economy was largely cashless, operating on a system of barter and credit, with the royal warehouse, Almacén, serving as the main point of exchange. The soldiers, both active and retired, formed a distinct social class. Their military duties included protecting the pueblo from perceived threats and capturing runaway neophytes from the mission. As retired soldiers were often granted large tracts of land, they became the genesis of the ranchero class, controlling more resources and wielding more influence than the original pobladores. They represented a direct link to the military and administrative authority of the Spanish crown. The most complex and exploitative relationship was with the indigenous population. Neophytes were regularly loaned out by the San Gabriel mission to work in the pueblo's fields, or as domestic servants in the homes of pobladores and soldiers. This labor was often coerced, part of a system designed to integrate the Tongva into the colonial economy as a permanent underclass. Non-missionized Tongva also sought work in the pueblo, frequently paid in goods or alcohol, creating cycles of dependency. This interaction, while economically crucial for the pueblo's survival, was fraught with conflict and systematically dismantled indigenous social structures. Civic governance was managed by the alcalde and the ayuntamiento, who adjudicated minor disputes, managed communal resources, and enforced the governor's decrees. Social life was insular and centered on the Catholic Church, with religious festivals marking the passage of the year. For its first 2 decades, the pueblo remained a small, isolated, and economically marginal outpost. Overshadowed by the wealth and power of the San Gabriel mission, its existence entirely dependent on the coerced labor of the region's first peoples. The mission system instigated a profound and irreversible ecological and demographic transformation of the Los Angeles basin. The introduction of vast herds of European livestock, particularly cattle, was a primary agent of this change. Unlike native herbivores, these animals grazed intensively and non-selectively, compacting the soil with their hooves and eradicating the native perennial bunch grasses that had dominated the landscape. This environmental disruption created ideal conditions for the proliferation of invasive Mediterranean annuals, such as wild oats and black mustard, which were better adapted to the disturbed, compacted soil. These non-native plants rapidly outcompeted and replaced the indigenous flora that the Tongva had relied upon for food, medicine, and material culture. The expansion of mission agriculture furthered this ecological conversion. Large tracts of land were cleared of their native oak woodlands, coastal sage scrub, and riparian vegetation to be ploughed for the cultivation of wheat, corn, and barley. The construction of extensive irrigation networks, or zanjas, diverted massive amounts of water from rivers and streams, fundamentally altering the region's hydrology and devastating the wetland ecosystems that had been critical hubs of biodiversity. For the indigenous population, confinement within the mission walls proved catastrophic. The high-density, unsanitary living conditions made the neophyte communities exceptionally vulnerable to Old World pathogens. Epidemics of measles, smallpox, and diphtheria, to which the Tongva had no inherited immunity, swept through the missions with devastating mortality rates. Mission records document a severe demographic collapse, with deaths consistently and dramatically outnumbering births. This biological assault was compounded by a drastic change in diet. The shift from a diverse and nutrient-rich forager diet to a monotonous, carbohydrate-heavy ration of grain mush, or atoll, led to widespread malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies, increasing susceptibility to disease. The ecological devastation of their ancestral lands and the demographic catastrophe within the mission walls created a cycle of dependency, making it nearly impossible for the Tongva to escape the system and return to their former way of life. The mission system did not just impose a new order, it actively dismantled the old one, irrevocably altering both the land and its people. The secularization of the Alta California missions, initiated by the Mexican government's Secularization Act of 1833, represented a monumental transfer of wealth and power that fundamentally reshaped the region's social and economic structure. Following Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821, Republican ideals and anti-clerical sentiments targeted the Franciscan-controlled missions as outdated relics of colonial authority. The official purpose of the act was emancipatory: to convert the missions into secular parishes, liberate the neophytes from their ward-like status, and distribute mission lands and assets among them as private property. Governor Jose Figueroa began implementing the decree in Alta California in 1834, but the intended outcome was systematically subverted. The neophytes, who had built the mission's vast agricultural and pastoral wealth, were largely dispossessed. While the law theoretically entitled them to plots of land and a share of the mission's livestock, corrupt and inefficient administration, combined with the neophytes' lack of legal or political power, ensured this rarely happened. Instead, the mission lands, which totaled millions of acres, were granted in enormous tracts, often tens of thousands of acres at a time, to politically influential Californios. These recipients were typically retired military officers, government officials, and well-connected families, who used their influence with governors like Figueroa, Juan Bautista Alvarado, and Pio Pico to secure these vast estates, or ranchos. This process effectively privatized the immense holdings of the church, creating a new landowning aristocracy. The newly emancipated indigenous population, now landless and lacking the means for independent subsistence, was transformed into a dependent labor force for the very ranchos that occupied their ancestral territories. Many were bound to the rancheros through a system of debt peonage, paid in goods rather than currency, creating a condition of servitude that was in many ways more precarious than their life under the Franciscans. The economic engine of this new era became the hide and tallow trade, as the great ranchos were primarily cattle operations. The mission's diversified agriculture was abandoned in favor of grazing massive herds, whose hides were traded to American and British merchants for finished goods, creating California's first significant link to the global market. The rancho economy of Mexican California was a monocultural system almost entirely dependent on the hide and tallow trade, which linked the isolated province to the industrializing economies of the United States and Great Britain. The vast herds of longhorn cattle, which grazed freely across the unfenced ranchos, were not valued for their meat, but as the source of two key commodities. The hides, often referred to as California banknotes, were the primary export. Shipped to Boston and Lynn, Massachusetts, they supplied the raw material for the booming shoe and leather goods industries, providing everything from footwear to the drive belts that ran the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. Tallow, the rendered fat of the cattle, was the second crucial commodity, exported primarily to Peru and other South American ports, where it was manufactured into candles and soap. The production process began with the annual matanza, or slaughter. This was a large-scale seasonal event where vaqueros would round up thousands of cattle. The process was notoriously wasteful, The animals were killed, skinned, and stripped of their fat, while the vast majority of the carcass was left to rot on the plains, consumed by grizzly bears and other scavengers. With no preservation methods and a small local market, the meat had almost no commercial value. Once harvested, the hides were scraped clean, staked out to dry in the sun until they were stiff as boards, and then folded for transport. The trade itself was conducted almost exclusively by foreign merchants, primarily Americans operating out of Boston. Their ships, laden with manufactured goods, would anchor offshore at roadsteads like San Pedro and Dana Point, functioning as floating department stores. Rancheros would exchange their hides and tallow directly for imported items, textiles, furniture, tools, liquor, and luxury goods. As hard currency was virtually non-existent in California, the physical logistics of this exchange were arduous. The stiff, heavy hides were transported to the coast in large ox-drawn carts, or carretas, and often unceremoniously thrown from the top of cliffs down to the beaches below. Sailors from the trading ships then had to wade into the surf to retrieve the hides, carry them on their heads through the waves to longboats, and row them back to the anchored vessel. This trade created substantial wealth for the small class of ranchero families, funding a lifestyle of elaborate fiestas and patriarchal hospitality, but it also locked California into a dependent colonial-style economy with no internal industrial development. The era of Mexican rule in California gave rise to a distinct landowning elite known as the Californios, a small, interrelated group of families who dominated the region's social, political, and economic life. This aristocracy, composed of families like the Sepulvedas, Lugos, Verdugos, and Picos, owed its ascendancy directly to the massive land grants issued following the mission's secularization. Their society was rigidly hierarchical and patriarchal, centered on the figure of the ranchero, who held absolute authority over his vast estate, his family, and a large workforce of indigenous laborers. Social cohesion was maintained through extensive kinship networks and the system of compadrazgo, which created powerful bonds of obligation between families through godparent relationships. Intermarriage among the elite was common, consolidating land ownership and political power into the hands of a few dozen families. The culture of the Californios was defined by expert horsemanship and a lavish, if rustic, hospitality. The vaquero was the archetypal figure of the era, and a man's worth was often measured by his skill in the saddle. Social life revolved around the rancho and was marked by elaborate celebrations, or fiestas, which could last for days and included horse races, bullfights, and fandangos. Despite the outward display of wealth in the form of fine imported clothing and silver-adorned saddles, the California economy was land-rich but cash-poor, operating primarily on barter. Politically, Alta California was a remote and often neglected territory of the Mexican Republic, a fact that fostered a spirit of independence and constant internal conflict. Governance was weak, with chronic rivalries between the northern families centered around the capital of Monterrey and the southern families of Los Angeles for control of the governorship and the territorial legislature, or Diputación. Figures like Pío Pico, the last Mexican governor, rose to power amidst this factionalism. This political fragmentation, combined with the province's economic dependence on foreign traders and its geographic isolation from central Mexico, created a power vacuum that made the region exceedingly vulnerable to the ambitions of the expansionist United States. The social world of the California elite was a complex interplay of elaborate communal festivities and deeply entrenched family rivalries, both of which served to reinforce the insular nature of their society. The primary vehicle for social interaction was the fandango, a gathering that was far more than a simple dance party. These events, held to celebrate weddings, baptisms, or religious holidays, were essential forums for reaffirming social status, negotiating alliances, and arranging the strategic marriages that consolidated landholdings. The etiquette was strict and formal, with dances like the jota, the san, and the jarabe, performed with prescribed steps to music from guitars and violins. Participation was a public performance of one's place in the social hierarchy, reflected in the lavish attire acquired through the hide trade. Men sported embroidered velveteen jackets and silver-laced trousers, while women wore gowns of imported silk and lace. Hospitality was a competitive and defining virtue, with families vying to host the most memorable and generous fiestas. Beneath this veneer of festive cordiality, however, lay a society rife with internal conflict, driven by personal honor and political ambition. The concept of family honor, or honra, was paramount, and any perceived insult could escalate into a lasting feud. These were not typically violent confrontations, but were waged through political maneuvering, social ostracism, and, most commonly, litigation over the poorly defined boundaries of their immense ranchos. The most significant of these conflicts was the regional rivalry between the Northern California families, such as the Alvarados and Vallejos of the Monterey Bay area, and the Southern families, like the Picos and Sepulvedas of Los Angeles. This was not merely a political dispute over the location of the capital or the control of customs duties at the ports. It was a deep-seated cultural and familial antagonism that periodically erupted into political revolts and near-civil war. This constant factionalism consumed the political energy of the California elite, preventing the formation of a unified provincial identity. Their focus on internal disputes and the preservation of family prestige left them strategically and psychologically unprepared for the cohesive external threat posed by the United in the 1840s. Under the Mexican Republic, Alta California functioned less as an integrated territory and more as a remote, self-governing penal colony, profoundly neglected by the central government in Mexico City. The immense overland distance, which could take months to traverse, rendered federal oversight almost entirely theoretical. Governors were appointed from the capital but were frequently overthrown by local revolts, and their directives were often ignored. The formal structure of governance existed on paper, with a territorial legislature, the Diputación, and local town councils, or ayuntamientos. In Los Angeles, the ayuntamiento, led by an elected alcalde who served as both mayor and judge, was the most immediate source of authority, but its power was consistently challenged and subverted by the dominant ranchero families. This political vacuum ensured that real power was decentralized, residing with the patriarchs of the great landowning clans. Economically, Mexico's policies were actively detrimental to the province. High tariffs were imposed on all foreign imports in an attempt to force trade through designated Mexican channels. The result, however, was the opposite, a thriving and institutionalized system of smuggling. The long, unguarded coastline made illicit trade with American and British ships a simple and necessary practice. The roadstead at San Pedro became the de facto port for Los Angeles, where foreign merchants conducted a brisk, illegal trade, exchanging manufactured goods for hides with virtually no interference from the token customs officials. Daily life for the majority of the pueblo's non-elite population was one of agrarian subsistence. The average poblador lived in a simple adobe house with a packed earth floor and subsisted on a small plot of land granted by the ayuntamiento, cultivating corn, beans, and grapes. The central plaza served as the hub for all community activities, from church services to public punishments. For the indigenous population released from the missions, secularization had traded one form of servitude for another. Now landless, they formed a marginalized underclass, providing the essential labor for the ranchos and the pueblo as vaqueros, domestic servants, and farmhands, often trapped in cycles of debt peonage. This combination of governmental neglect, economic reliance on smuggling, and a rigid social hierarchy created a fragile and isolated society, fundamentally unprepared for the impending era of American expansion. The economic lifeblood of Mexican Los Angeles flowed through San Pedro, a port that was less a harbor and more a geographical inconvenience. It was an open, unsheltered roadstead, exposed to the full force of Pacific storms, particularly the seasonal southeasterly gales. Ships had to anchor a considerable distance from shore in deep water, making the process of loading and unloading both laborious and perilous. The primary business was conducted by a fleet of American and British trading vessels, famously dubbed hide droggers, which would spend up to 2 years plying the California coast. Their operation at San Pedro was a model of rustic inefficiency. Hides, the California banknotes, were brought from the inland ranchos in large, clumsy, 2-wheeled ox carts called carretas. This overland journey of more than 20 miles from the pueblo was slow and arduous. Upon reaching the coast, the hides were often cured and stored in large barn-like structures built by the shipping company's resident agents. The transfer of cargo was primitive. Sailors would row small launches laden with goods through the surf to the beach, while hides were transported out to the anchored ships in the same manner. A more dramatic method, famously described by Richard Henry Dana Jr., involved throwing the stiff, dried hides from the top of the steep cliffs of the Palos Verdes Peninsula to be collected by sailors in boats below. This entire enterprise operated in a grey market of institutionalized smuggling. Although Mexican law required duties to be paid at the official port of entry in Monterrey, the central government's authority in Southern California was so negligible that these regulations were openly flouted. Ships' supercargoes would negotiate directly with the rancheros or their agents, like the American expatriate Abel Stearns, conducting a tax-free trade that was the de facto economic policy of the region. For the multinational crews of these ships, San Pedro was an isolated and desolate worksite, not a gateway to a new world. Their lives consisted of the back-breaking labor of rowing launches and curing hides on the beaches, with little interaction with the Californio elite. This remote, wind-swept roadstead, for all its physical shortcomings, was the pueblo's sole and vital conduit to the global economy, the point of entry for the foreign goods, ideas, and eventually, the people who would fundamentally reshape its destiny. The insular world of Mexican California was irrevocably breached in 1826, not by sea, but by land. In November of that year, the American fur trapper Jedediah Smith led a party of 16 men across the Mojave Desert, becoming the first United States citizens to reach the province overland. Their unannounced arrival at the San Gabriel mission was met with deep suspicion by Mexican authorities. Governor José María de Echeandía, viewing them not as traders but as foreign spies and the vanguard of American encroachment, detained Smith before ordering him and his party to leave the territory. This event was a geopolitical turning point. It demonstrated the permeability of California's vast, unguarded eastern frontier and signaled the beginning of direct American overland contact. Smith was an archetype of the mountain man, a class of itinerant trappers driven by the lucrative beaver pelt trade, who served as the de facto explorers of the American West. Their reports, sent back to Street, Louis and published in Eastern newspapers, described a fertile, temperate land with a sparse population and a weak, distant government. A more regularized overland route, the Old Spanish Trail, was established in 1829, connecting Santa Fe to Los Angeles. This was not a trapper's path, but a commercial artery for a different kind of commerce. New Mexican merchants brought woolen goods, particularly serapes, to trade for California's abundant horses and mules, many of which were driven back to markets on the American frontier. Concurrently, a small but influential cadre of American and other foreign expatriates began to settle permanently in Los Angeles. These men, such as Jonathan Trumbull Warner and John Temple, were not transient adventurers, but merchants and artisans who integrated themselves into California society. The path to acceptance and influence was a calculated process of assimilation. They became naturalized Mexican citizens, formally converted to Roman Catholicism, and, most crucially, married the daughters of prominent landowning families, thereby gaining access to land and political power. These individual incursions by trappers, traders, and settlers were the practical application of a burgeoning national ideology in the United States, manifest destiny. This doctrine, which asserted a divinely sanctioned right to continental expansion, was fueled by the very reports these first arrivals sent back east, painting a picture of a land ripe for American acquisition. The uneasy coexistence between the established California elite and the growing number of Anglo-American arrivals began to systematically break down in the 1840s. The primary source of friction was a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict over the concept of land ownership and use. The California system was based on enormous, vaguely defined land grants, or diseños, which were often demarcated by natural features like streams or oak trees. These grants supported a pastoral, cattle-based economy and were viewed as much as a marker of social status as a unit of production. In stark contrast, the Anglo-American settlers brought with them the Jeffersonian ideal of the small, intensively cultivated family farm, legally defined by precise, surveyed boundaries and recorded deeds. This legalistic and agricultural mindset led to a direct challenge to the ranchos. American squatters began to occupy what they considered unimproved rancho lands, confident that the American legal system they anticipated would eventually validate their claims over the sprawling, unproductive California estates. This demographic shift was accelerated by organized overland migrations, such as the Workman Roland Party of 1841. Unlike the earlier generation of assimilating American merchants, these new arrivals were Protestant farming families who had no intention of becoming Mexican citizens or converting to Catholicism. They established separate communities, such as Agua Mansa near present-day Riverside, creating enclaves of American culture that were insular and often hostile to their California neighbors. These tensions were further inflamed by geopolitical events. The United States government began to take a more active and aggressive interest in the territory, dispatching official expeditions under the guise of scientific exploration. The most notable of these was led by John C. Fremont, an Army topographical engineer whose repeated and often belligerent incursions into California between 1844 and 1846 were thinly veiled military reconnaissance missions. Fremont actively encouraged dissent among the American settlers and made it clear that U.S. annexation was not a matter of if, but when. The internal political instability of Alta California, marked by frequent revolts and a deep-seated rivalry between the northern and southern regions, provided fertile ground for this American interference, further weakening the old order and setting the stage for its violent collapse. The formal declaration of war by the United States against Mexico in May 1846 transformed the simmering tensions in Alta California into open conflict. The initial military action was naval. On July 7th, Commodore John D. Sloat, commanding the U.S. Pacific Squadron, seized Monterey, the provincial capital, issuing a relatively conciliatory proclamation promising to respect Californian rights and property. However, Sloat was soon replaced by the more bellicose Commodore Robert F. Stockton, who, in collaboration with John C. Fremont's California Battalion, adopted a far more aggressive conquest strategy. Stockton's primary objective was the seizure of Los Angeles, the demographic and political center of Southern California. In early August, Stockton landed a force of sailors and Marines at San Pedro, preparing for an overland march on the pueblo. The California defense was non-existent. The province's leadership had completely fragmented. Governor Pio Pico and General Jose Castro, unable to muster a meaningful military force and facing internal rivalries, fled south into Mexico. This leadership vacuum left the local Angelinos without direction or the means to resist. On August 13, 1846, Stockton and Fremont marched their combined forces into Los Angeles and occupied the pueblo without a single shot being fired. They raised the American flag over the government house, and Stockton issued a proclamation annexing California as a territory of the United States. Believing the conquest complete, Stockton departed in September, leaving Captain Archibald Gillespie, a U.S. Marine officer, in command of a small garrison of approximately 50 men. Gillespie's brief tenure was a catastrophic failure in military governance. A rigid and culturally insensitive commander, he immediately imposed a series of draconian measures on the local populace. He declared martial law, established a strict curfew, banned public gatherings, and prohibited the carrying of weapons. His troops, imbued with a sense of racial and cultural superiority, treated the Californios with contempt. This oppressive administration, coming after a period of relative autonomy under lax Mexican rule, swiftly turned a passively occupied populace into a hostile and rebellious one, directly precipitating the siege of Los Angeles and reversing the initial, deceptively easy American victory. Captain Gillespie's misrule ignited the latent California resentment into organized rebellion. The revolt began on September 23, 1846, led by a cadre of prominent citizens, including Jose Maria Flores, Andres Pico, and Sabulo Varela. The immediate catalyst was Gillespie's attempt to arrest Varela, which prompted a swift and coordinated uprising. Within a day, several hundred California lancers, renowned for their superior horsemanship, converged on Los Angeles. They effectively surrounded Gillespie's small garrison, which hastily fortified itself in the adobe government house overlooking the main plaza. The Californios, though lacking significant infantry or artillery, possessed a decisive tactical advantage in their cavalry. These lancers, armed with long 9-foot lances and skilled in mounted combat from decades of cattle ranching, controlled the open country and could strike with speed and precision, completely isolating the American position. The siege was a masterclass in psychological warfare and asymmetrical tactics. The Californios established their headquarters on a hill overlooking the plaza, later known as Fort Moore Hill. From this vantage point, they created the illusion of a much larger and better equipped force. In a celebrated act of ingenuity, they unearthed a small, antiquated cannon that had been hidden in the garden of an elderly woman, Inocencia Reyes. This old woman's gun, though of minimal military value, was paraded with great fanfare, its occasional firing serving to demoralize the trapped Americans. After nearly a week of constant harassment, dwindling supplies, and the realization that no relief was forthcoming, Gillespie was forced to negotiate. On September 30, 1846, he formally surrendered to Flores. The terms were remarkably lenient. Gillespie and his men were permitted to march with their firearms to San Pedro, where they would be evacuated by a merchant vessel. They were paroled on the condition that they would not take up arms against Mexico again during the war. This bloodless victory for the Californios was a stunning reversal of the American conquest. They had successfully expelled the occupying force and re-established control over the largest pueblo in Southern California, a feat that demonstrated their military resolve and temporarily halted the advance of U.S. forces in the region. The Californio victory at the Siege of Los Angeles was short-lived, as it prompted a decisive and multi-pronged American military response. In San Diego, Commodore Robert F. Stockton reorganized his naval forces, preparing for a second, more powerful overland campaign. Simultaneously, General Stephen W. Kearny's Army of the West, a force of U.S. dragoons, arrived in Southern California after an arduous march from Santa Fe. On December 6, 1846, Kearny's exhausted command was engaged by a contingent of California lancers under Andres Pico at the Battle of San Pascual. While the Californios secured a tactical victory, inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans, Kearny's force was not destroyed and eventually linked up with Stockton's command in San Diego. The combined American army, now numbering over 600 men and equipped with superior artillery, began its definitive march north toward Los Angeles in late December. The final engagements for control of the region occurred on January 8 and 9, 1847. At the Battle of Rio San Gabriel and the subsequent Battle of La Mesa, the American forces decisively defeated the main Californio army. The American use of disciplined infantry squares and effective artillery fire proved superior to the charges of the Californio cavalry, breaking their military capability. Following these defeats, the Californio commander, Jose Maria Flores, fled to Mexico, leaving Andres Pico in command of the remaining demoralized forces. Realizing the futility of further resistance, Pico chose negotiation over a protracted guerrilla war. Concurrently, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fremont was advancing south from Monterrey with his California battalion. It was Fremont, acting with a degree of independence from Stockton and Kearny, who encountered Pico's surrendering forces. On January 13, 1847, at a rancho in the Cahuenga Pass, Fremont and Pico signed the Treaty of Cahuenga. The terms were notably magnanimous. The Californios were to surrender their artillery and promise not to take up arms again, but they were permitted to return to their homes, retain their property, and were guaranteed the full rights and protections of United States citizens. This act of clemency effectively ended all hostilities in California, providing a framework for reconciliation and securing the territory for the U.S. More than a year before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo formally ended the wider war. While the Treaty of Cahuenga secured a localized peace in California, the broader Mexican-American War continued for another year, culminating in the American capture of Mexico City in September 1847. With its capital occupied and its armies defeated, the Mexican government was forced to enter into negotiations under duress. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, was a geopolitical document of immense consequence, formalizing the transfer of a vast portion of Mexico's northern territory to the United States. The chief American negotiator, Nicholas Trist, controversially defied a recall order from President James K. Polk to conclude the agreement, believing that a failure to do so would lead to the complete annexation of Mexico. The treaty's central provision was the Mexican Cession, outlined in Article 5. Mexico relinquished its claim to more than 525,000 square miles of territory, nearly half its domain, encompassing present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In return, the United States agreed to pay Mexico a sum of $15 million, a figure intended as compensation and a way to legitimize the territorial acquisition, framing it as a purchase rather than pure conquest. The U.S. also assumed approximately $3.25 million in debts owed by the Mexican government to American citizens. The treaty redrew the map of North America, establishing the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas and defining a new international boundary that ran west to the Pacific Ocean. Crucially, Articles 8 and IANCs of the treaty addressed the status of the estimated 80 to 100 Mexican nationals now residing within the ceded territories. These articles offered them a choice: either relocate south of the new border or, by remaining, receive full United States citizenship after 1 year. The treaty explicitly guaranteed the protection of their property rights, including the large land grants of the Californios, and assured their free enjoyment of their liberty and property and secured in the free exercise of their religion without restriction. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty on March 10, 1848, but not before making significant amendments, most notably striking out Article X, which would have provided a more robust and explicit protection for Mexican land grants. This alteration would have profound and detrimental consequences for the California landowners in the decades to come, undermining the very protections the treaty had promised and facilitating their eventual dispossession. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill on January 24, 1848, a mere 9 days before the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, triggered a demographic and economic cataclysm that reshaped California. While the epicenter of the gold rush was hundreds of miles to the north, its economic shockwave reverberated powerfully in Los Angeles, paradoxically creating a final spectacular boom for the California rancheros. The established hide and tallow trade became obsolete almost overnight. The influx of hundreds of thousands of gold seekers into Northern California created an insatiable, localized demand for fresh meat. The value of cattle, previously determined by the worth of their hides at a few dollars per head, skyrocketed. Prices for a single steer in the mining camps could reach anywhere from $50 to $75 an increase of over 500%. This economic shift transformed the southern ranchos into the primary beef suppliers for the entire state. A period of intense prosperity, often called the cattle boom or the golden age of the cattle trade, began. The rancheros organized massive cattle drives, moving thousands of head of livestock from the pastures of Los Angeles and the surrounding counties northwards along the coastal route or through the Central Valley. These drives were complex logistical operations, requiring skilled vaqueros to manage the herds over weeks of arduous travel. For a brief period, between roughly 1849 and 1855, this trade infused the southern economy with unprecedented levels of hard currency. Gold dust and American dollars replaced the barter system and hide-based California banknotes that had defined the Mexican era. This sudden wealth allowed the ranchero elite to indulge in conspicuous consumption, importing luxury goods, hosting extravagant social events, and temporarily reinforcing their social and economic dominance. However, this prosperity was a fragile bubble. The immense profits discouraged investment in agricultural diversification or infrastructure. Furthermore, the high demand for beef attracted American cattlemen who drove herds from Texas and the Midwest, increasing competition and eventually saturating the market. The boom was an ephemeral Indian summer for the California way of life, masking the profound economic and demographic shifts that would soon lead to its collapse. The demographic deluge and sudden wealth accompanying the gold rush era rapidly destabilized the social order of Los Angeles, transforming the once sleepy pueblo into one of the most violent frontier towns in the United States. The influx of Anglo-American prospectors, disillusioned miners, gamblers, and outlaws overwhelmed the nascent American legal system and marginalized the established California population. Between 1850 and 1870, Los Angeles recorded a homicide rate that was arguably the highest in the nation, with historians estimating it to be many times greater than that of notorious cattle towns like Dodge City. The center of this lawlessness was a short alley near the old plaza known as Calle de los Negros, a district densely packed with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. Contemporary accounts describe it as a scene of constant violence, where disputes were settled with knives and pistols, and bodies were a common sight in the morning. The formal institutions of justice were wholly inadequate to cope with this endemic violence. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office was underfunded and often complicit in the chaos. The court system was slow, susceptible to corruption, and crippled by linguistic barriers between English and Spanish speakers. This power vacuum led directly to the rise of extra-legal vigilance committees. Composed primarily of influential Anglo-American merchants and citizens, these committees usurped the functions of the state, holding impromptu trials and carrying out public executions by hanging. While ostensibly formed to impose order, vigilante justice was frequently an instrument of racial and social control. Lynchings disproportionately targeted Mexicans, Native Americans, and later Chinese immigrants. For example, the case of Francisco Cota, accused of murder in 1857, saw a vigilante mob storm the jail and lynch him and his associate, bypassing the formal judicial process entirely. Similarly, the Flores Daniel gang of outlaws was hunted down, and its members summarily executed by vigilante poses in 1857. These actions were not seen as lawless by their perpetrators, but as a necessary civic duty to cleanse the community of undesirable elements, a sentiment that reflected the deep ethnic and class antagonisms defining this violent period of transition. The endemic violence of frontier Los Angeles culminated in one of the deadliest incidents of racial violence in American history on October 24, 1871. By this time, a small but visible Chinese community had established itself in a section of Calle de los Negros, living within the old Coronel adobe building. Subjected to pervasive anti-immigrant sentiment and discriminatory local ordinances, the community was largely insular. The catalyst for the massacre was an internal conflict between two rival Chinese tongs, the Hongqiao and Ninyang companies, reportedly over the abduction of a woman named Yut Ho. A gunfight erupted between the factions, inadvertently resulting in the death of a white rancher, Robert Thompson, who had responded to the scene, and the wounding of a police officer, Jesus Bilderain. The death of an Anglo man at the hands of Chinese individuals, regardless of the context, ignited the city's simmering racial animosity. A mob of approximately 500 white and Latino men representing nearly a tenth of the city's population descended upon the small enclave. For hours, the mob engaged in a systematic campaign of murder and plunder. They dragged Chinese men from their homes and businesses, shooting, stabbing, and hanging them from any available structure, including the wooden awning of a wagon shop and the crossbeam of a corral gate. The Coronel Adobe was besieged, its doors broken down, and its residents murdered. The violence was indiscriminate, targeting individuals irrespective of their involvement in the initial dispute. In total, at least 18 Chinese men and boys were lynched or otherwise killed by the mob, a figure constituting a significant portion of the city's Chinese population. Among the victims was Dr. Jean Tong, a respected physician, who was reportedly dragged from his home and hanged after offering his possessions to the mob in exchange for his life. The subsequent legal response underscored the era's skewed justice. Grand jury indictments were issued against dozens of rioters, but only 10 were brought to trial. Of those, 8 were convicted of manslaughter. However, in a ruling that exemplified the legal system's failings, their convictions were overturned by the California Supreme Court on a technicality. The indictment had failed to allege that the Chinese victim had been murdered. No one was ever retried, and no one ultimately served any significant time for their role in one of the largest mass lynchings in the nation's history. While the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo nominally guaranteed the property rights of Mexican citizens, the California Land Act of 1851 effectively nullified those protections through a complex and biased legal process. Passed by the U.S. Congress, the act established a 3-member Board of Land Commissioners to review the validity of all Spanish and Mexican land grants in California. Superficially, this appeared to be a standard administrative procedure. In practice, it was a mechanism of dispossession that placed an enormous legal and financial burden on the California landowners. The fundamental conflict arose from the incompatibility of two different legal and cultural systems of land ownership. Mexican land grants were often imprecise, defining boundaries with natural landmarks like rivers, oak trees, or rock outcroppings, accompanied by hand-drawn maps called diseños. Title was often based on long-term possession and use rather than detailed paperwork. The American system, by contrast, demanded precise, surveyed boundaries documented through a rigorous chain of title. The Land Act forced the Californios to prove their ownership according to these unfamiliar and stringent American standards. Every rancho owner was required to file a claim with the board, typically in San Francisco, initiating a protracted and costly legal battle. The burden of proof rested entirely on the claimant. They had to produce original grant documents, provide testimony from witnesses to the original grant, and pay for expensive new surveys conducted to American specifications. Many families had lost documents over decades or possessed grants that were informal or incomplete by US standards. The litigation was a multi-stage process. Even if a claim was confirmed by the Commission, the US government could appeal the decision to the District Court and subsequently the Supreme Court. The average land claim case took 17 years to resolve. To navigate this system, rancheros were forced to hire American lawyers, often signing over a significant portion of their land, sometimes as much as a quarter, as a contingency fee. To pay for surveys, court costs, and new property taxes, they took out mortgages at ruinous interest rates, frequently from the very lawyers and speculators who coveted their land. While approximately 75% of the original land grants in Southern California were eventually confirmed, the legal victory was almost always a financial catastrophe. By the time title was cleared, many California families were bankrupt, forced to sell their remaining lands to satisfy debts incurred defending them. The Land Act of 1851 thus functioned as a highly effective, quasi-legal instrument for transferring millions of acres from the founding Californio families to Anglo-American hands, dismantling the rancho economy and the political power of its elite. The Americanization of Los Angeles was inscribed not only in law, but in the very materials of its construction, marking a deliberate architectural and institutional departure from the Californio era. The post-1850s city witnessed a physical transformation from a landscape of single-story, sun-dried adobe structures to a town defined by multi-story buildings of fired brick and milled lumber. This was more than an aesthetic evolution. It was a statement of economic and cultural permanence. The first two-story brick building, erected by merchant Benjamin Davis Wilson in 1854, heralded the end of the adobe's dominance. Unlike adobe, which was locally sourced and labor-intensive, brick required kilns and capital, while dimensional lumber had to be imported by sea from the forests of Northern California. These materials signified a connection to the industrial economy of the United States and a commitment to building a commercial center. This new architectural grammar coalesced around the Temple Block, constructed by Jonathan Temple between 1858 and 1871. Situated south of the Old Plaza, it became the city's new commercial nucleus, supplanting the historic center of the pueblo. Its brick facades, glass-plate windows, and ironwork announced a new urban order. It housed the city's first theater, professional offices, and the influential Bank of Temple and Workmen, a key institution in the shift from the barter-based rancho economy to a cash and credit-based American system. This physical reconstruction was mirrored by an institutional one. Los Angeles was incorporated as an American city in 1850, months before California achieved statehood. A common council was established, and the first American-style municipal government began the process of imposing a grid system on the pueblo's more organic layout. New institutions followed in rapid succession. The first public school opened its doors, and the establishment of the first Protestant congregations, such as the First Protestant Society founded in 1853, began to erode the centuries-old Catholic monopoly on the region's spiritual life. The founding of the Los Angeles Star newspaper in 1851 provided an English-language voice that promoted American commercial interests and political ideologies, often at the expense of the Spanish-language press and the Californio perspective. Fraternal organizations like the Freemasons established lodges, creating new networks of power and influence exclusive to the Anglo-American elite. Together, the construction of brick commercial blocks and the establishment of American banks, courts, schools, and newspapers created a new urban reality, physically and culturally overwriting the pueblo and cementing the city's identity as a burgeoning American commercial outpost. The integration of Los Angeles into the national transportation network was not a foregone conclusion, but the result of a protracted and costly struggle against a powerful corporate monopoly. For decades, the city remained a remote outpost, connected to the outside world primarily by sea and stagecoach. The first local line, the Los Angeles-San Pedro Railroad, completed in 1869, merely connected the city to its port, doing little to break its profound isolation. The true agent of change was the Southern Pacific Railroad, controlled by the Big Four Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. As the Southern Pacific extended its transcontinental line eastward from Northern California, it initially planned to bypass Los Angeles entirely, opting for a route through the Mojave Desert. The city's leaders, recognizing this as an existential threat, entered into intense negotiations. In 1872, the Southern Pacific presented its terms. Los Angeles would have to pay a subsidy of $602,000, roughly 5% of the county's assessed property value, provide a 60-acre depot site, and surrender its controlling stock in the local Los Angeles-San Pedro line. After a contentious campaign, voters approved the deal, securing the connection that finally arrived in 1876. However, this connection came at the price of a complete transportation monopoly. The Southern Pacific leveraged its control to impose exorbitant freight rates, effectively throttling the region's agricultural and commercial growth. The city's economic future remained constrained until a competitor emerged, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, building its own transcontinental line, reached Southern California in 1885 after acquiring smaller lines and completing a connection across the Cajon Pass. The arrival of a rival railroad immediately shattered the Southern Pacific's monopoly and ignited one of the most famous rate wars in American history. In the spring of 1886, passenger fares plummeted. A ticket from Kansas City to Los Angeles, which had cost over $100, dropped to $25, then to $12, and at the war's peak, briefly to a single $1. This dramatic fare reduction unleashed an unprecedented wave of migration. The boom of the 80s saw tens of thousands of Midwesterners flood into Southern California, triggering a speculative real estate frenzy. The city's population tripled in a decade. New towns were platted across the landscape, and the economic and demographic foundations of modern Los Angeles were irrevocably laid, all as a direct consequence of the corporate battle between two railroad giants. The economic engine that powered Southern California's late 19th century boom was not gold or oil, but a Brazilian botanical mutation, the Washington navel orange, a seedless, winter-ripening variety, single-handedly created the region's citrus industry and provided the central icon for a national marketing campaign that sold Los Angeles as a temperate paradise. The industry's origin can be traced to two specific trees. In 1873, Eliza Tibbets, a resident of Riverside, received 2 budded saplings from William Saunders of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who had obtained the parent stock from Bahia, Brazil. These 2 trees, thriving in the local climate, became the progenitors of every Washington navel orange in the state. The fruit's commercial advantages were profound. Its seedless nature made it highly desirable. Its thick skin facilitated long-distance shipping on the new refrigerated rail cars, and its winter harvest season meant it arrived in eastern markets when other fresh fruit was scarce. This biological windfall transformed the region's agriculture from subsistence farming and cattle ranching into a high-value, export-oriented industry. The success of the crop led to the creation of sophisticated business structures to manage its distribution and marketing. Growers formed cooperatives to pool resources, standardize quality, and increase their leverage against the powerful railroads. The most significant of these was the Southern California Fruit Exchange, founded in 1893, which would later become Sunkist Growers. This organization pioneered modern branding and advertising techniques on a national scale. The most visible tool of this effort was the citrus crate label. These vibrant, lithographed artworks were not mere product identifiers. They were potent advertisements for a lifestyle. The labels depicted a romanticized California, a landscape of perpetual sunshine, snow-capped mountains overlooking lush groves, and mission-style architecture, deliberately crafting an image of health, prosperity, and exotic allure. This imagery was disseminated across the country, appearing in grocery stores from New York to Chicago. The navel orange became more than a fruit. It was a tangible piece of the California dream, an edible postcard from a golden land. This powerful marketing narrative, coupled with the low railroad fares of the 1880s, fueled a second major wave of migration, attracting health seekers, retirees, and farmers who transformed vast swathes of the Los Angeles basin into a meticulously irrigated landscape of citrus groves. The railroad rate war of 1886-1887 was the catalyst for an unprecedented demographic and economic convulsion known as the Great Boom. The drastic reduction in passenger fares unleashed a torrent of migration, primarily from the Protestant Midwest, which fundamentally reshaped the social and physical landscape of Los Angeles County. This influx triggered a speculative real estate mania of historic proportions. The primary assets in this frenzy were the vast tracts of the former California ranchos, which were rapidly acquired by syndicates of Anglo-American capitalists. These land development companies systematically subdivided the ranchos, platting grids for new towns across the basin. The methodology for selling these lots became a spectacle in itself. Promoters organized free railroad excursions from Los Angeles to the site of a new subdivision. Potential buyers were lured with the promise of a free lunch and entertainment from a brass band, creating a festival-like atmosphere for the land auction that followed. This high-pressure sales environment, fueled by collective excitement and speculative fever, saw lots in non-existent towns sold for exorbitant prices. Between 1,887 and 1,889, developers platted more than 60 new towns in Los Angeles County. Some, like Pasadena, Monrovia, and Glendale, were established by organized colonies of Midwesterners and evolved into durable communities. However, a significant number were purely speculative paper towns, existing only on subdivision maps, often in arid or inaccessible locations. These phantom communities were designed solely to extract capital from naive investors before the inevitable collapse. Tourism was both a cause and a consequence of the boom. Many new arrivals first came as tourists, drawn by the marketing narrative of a health-giving paradise. They stayed to invest, and the influx of new residents and visitors, in turn, fueled the construction of grand tourist hotels like the Raymond Hotel in South Pasadena and the Hotel Arcadia in Santa Monica. The speculative bubble, built on inflated land values and easy credit, was unsustainable. The boom collapsed abruptly in 1888. Land values plummeted, banks failed, and many of the newly platted towns were abandoned, their survey stakes left to rot in the sunday. The frenzy was over, but its consequences were permanent. The population of Los Angeles had exploded from just over 0 in 1,880 to more than 50, 0 by 1,890, and the California majority was permanently displaced. The boom left behind a new urban geography and a demographic base that would define the city for the next century. The rapid growth of Los Angeles following the railroad's arrival was not merely a spontaneous migration. It was the result of a deliberate, highly organized, and relentless promotional campaign orchestrated by a powerful group of business elites known as the Boosters. At the heart of this movement was the Los Angeles Times, which, under the iron-fisted control of Harrison Gray Otis, was transformed from a provincial newspaper into the primary propaganda organ for regional development. Otis, a Civil War veteran who acquired a controlling interest in the paper in 1882, used its pages to construct and disseminate a carefully curated myth of Southern California. This narrative was designed to attract a specific type of immigrant: white, Protestant, and financially solvent individuals from the Midwest and East Coast. The Booster Coalition extended beyond the Times to include the city's most powerful institutions, chief among them the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. Reorganized in 1888, the chamber became the operational arm of the Booster Project. It was a private entity functioning with the power of a quasi-governmental agency, funded by the city's business establishment, including real estate developers, bankers, and the Southern Pacific Railroad. The chamber's methods were systematic and national in scope. It dispatched lecturers across the country, armed with lantern slides depicting a sun-drenched, prosperous landscape. It published and distributed millions of pamphlets filled with statistical data on agricultural yields and business opportunities, alongside romanticized depictions of life in a temperate paradise. One of its most effective tools was the California on Wheels, a custom-built railroad car that served as a traveling exhibition. This mobile museum, filled with agricultural displays and promotional literature, toured the towns and county fairs of the Midwest, bringing the myth of Southern California directly to its target audience. The ideology they promoted was a potent mix of economic promise and racial and cultural chauvinism. The narrative deliberately erased the region's Mexican heritage, presenting it as a vacant land awaiting cultivation by industrious Anglo-Saxons. It sold the climate not just as pleasant, but as a cure for diseases like tuberculosis, attracting a wave of health seekers. This meticulously crafted campaign, sustained for decades by the city's power brokers, was instrumental in engineering the demographic and cultural transformation of Los Angeles. The exponential growth engineered by the boosters created an existential crisis. The city's sole water source, the Los Angeles River, was insufficient to sustain the projected population. By 1904, it was clear that without a new massive water supply, the metropolis envisioned by the city's elite was an impossibility. The solution was conceived and executed by William Mulholland, the Irish immigrant and self-taught engineer who headed the municipal water department. Mulholland, in collaboration with former Mayor Fred Eaton, identified the Owens River, flowing from the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains, as the only viable source. The plan was audacious: to build a 233-mile-long aqueduct to transport the river's entire flow across the Mojave Desert and the San Gabriel Mountains into the San Fernando Valley. Securing the necessary water rights involved a campaign of systematic deception and political manipulation. Agents from the Los Angeles Water Department, posing as ranchers and federal reclamation agents, began covertly purchasing key parcels of land and their associated water rights from farmers and ranchers in the Owens Valley. Simultaneously, the city's powerful allies in Washington, D.C. worked to subvert a planned U.S. Reclamation Service irrigation project that would have used the Owens River water to benefit local agriculture. Through political maneuvering, the federal government was convinced to abandon its project, clearing the way for Los Angeles to claim the water. Construction of the Los Angeles Aqueduct began in 1908 and was, at the time, the largest municipal engineering project in American history. It was a monumental undertaking, employing a workforce of over 50 men who labored in extreme desert conditions. The gravity-fed system required the digging of 142 tunnels, the laying of 12 miles of inverted steel siphons to cross canyons, and the construction of over 20 miles of open-lined canal. Upon its completion in 1913, Mulholland famously declared, "There it island take it." The aqueduct's arrival had immediate and profound consequences. It not only provided the water necessary for continued population growth, but also became a powerful tool for political consolidation. The city of Los Angeles, now controlling a vast water surplus, used it as leverage to force the annexation of surrounding independent communities, most notably the entire San Fernando Valley, which was transformed from arid ranchland into a new suburban frontier. The project secured the city's future, but did so at the cost of devastating the Owens Valley's economy and ecology, initiating a century of bitter conflict over water in the American West. For Los Angeles to transcend its status as a regional agricultural hub, the construction of a deep water port was an economic imperative. The existing shallow wharf at San Pedro was inadequate for modern ocean-going vessels, creating a critical bottleneck for trade. The debate over the location of a federally funded harbor ignited a prolonged and bitter political conflict in the 1890s, pitting the city's civic leadership against the era's most powerful corporation. On one side was the Southern Pacific Railroad, led by Collis P. Huntington. The railroad had invested heavily in Santa Monica, purchasing vast tracts of land and constructing an enormous pier, the Long Wharf, which extended 700 feet into the bay. Huntington's objective was a monopoly. By ensuring the official port was located where the Southern Pacific controlled all land access, he could dictate the terms of all commerce entering and leaving the region. Opposing this was a formidable coalition of Los Angeles business leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, and Harrison Gray Otis's Los Angeles Times. They advocated for a free harbor at San Pedro, one that would be publicly controlled and accessible to competing railroads, thereby preventing a corporate stranglehold on the city's economic future. The struggle was fought in the halls of Congress and on the pages of the Times. Huntington's lobbyists exerted immense pressure in Washington, while the Southern Pacific threatened to bypass Los Angeles entirely if its demands were not met. In response, Otis waged a relentless propaganda war, famously depicting the Southern Pacific as a malevolent octopus strangling the city's prosperity. The key figure in the political fight was U.S. Senator Stephen M. White, who became the city's champion against the railroad's powerful influence. The technical debate centered on the geographic suitability of the two locations. While Huntington promoted his long wharf as a feat of modern engineering, proponents of San Pedro argued that its bay offered superior natural protection from storms, a critical factor for a commercial harbor. The stalemate was broken when Congress appointed a board of engineering experts, the Walker Board, to conduct an impartial investigation. After extensive study, the board concluded in 1897 that San Pedro was unequivocally the more suitable site. This expert recommendation proved decisive. Congress appropriated $2.9 million for the construction of a breakwater at San Pedro, and work began in 1899. The victory in the Free Harbor fight was a pivotal moment, marking a rare defeat for the Southern Pacific and securing a publicly controlled gateway to the Pacific that would be essential for the city's 20th century expansion. The completion of the Los Angeles Aqueduct in 1913 was not merely an engineering triumph, it was the trigger for a calculated and highly profitable political maneuver that fundamentally redefined the city's geography. The aqueduct's terminus was deliberately sited at the northern edge of the San Fernando Valley, and the vast surplus of water it provided became the instrument for the city's massive expansion. This expansion was orchestrated by a powerful syndicate of investors with insider knowledge of the aqueduct project. This group, which included Harrison Gray Otis, his son-in-law Harry Chandler, Henry Huntington, and other members of the city's ruling elite, had secretly formed the San Fernando Valley Syndicate. Prior to the public's full awareness of the aqueduct's route and scale, they methodically purchased over 47 acres of arid, low-value agricultural land in the valley for approximately $2.5 million. Their strategy hinged on a specific and crucial provision within the Los Angeles City Charter. The municipality was legally prohibited from selling its surplus water outside of its official boundaries. This legal restriction transformed the aqueduct's water from a simple utility into a potent political weapon. While the public had been sold on the aqueduct as a necessity for the existing city's domestic survival, the syndicate understood its true purpose was to fuel suburban expansion on land they now controlled. With the aqueduct's flow secured, the syndicate's land holdings were positioned to become immensely valuable, but only if they could gain access to the water. The independent farmers and small communities of the San Fernando Valley, struggling with their own limited water resources from local wells and the Los Angeles River, were placed in an untenable position. They could either watch their agricultural enterprises wither from drought, or they could join the city that held a monopoly on the new, abundant water supply. The choice was engineered to be no choice at all. In 1915, facing this reality, the residents of the San Fernando Valley voted overwhelmingly for annexation. This single act more than doubled the land area of Los Angeles, adding 170 square miles to the city's territory. It was the largest municipal annexation in the nation's history, a move that created a vast new landscape for real estate development and suburbanization, generating immense fortunes for the syndicate members who had orchestrated the entire affair. While water and real estate were shaping the city's horizontal expansion, a different resource boom was about to transform its economic foundations vertically, drilling deep into the geologic strata below. The Los Angeles Basin is a profound syncline, a structural downfold in the Earth's crust that, over millions of years, trapped and cooked vast quantities of marine organic matter into immense petroleum reserves. Though surface tar seeps had been known for centuries, the industrial potential of this resource was first tapped in 1892, when Edward Doney and Charles Canfield drilled a successful well using a eucalyptus log near West 2nd Street, igniting the city's first minor oil boom. This initial discovery, however, was a precursor to the massive strikes that would occur in the 1920s. The true transformation began in 1920, with the discovery of the Huntington Beach oil field, followed in rapid succession by the monumental gushers at Signal Hill in Long Beach in 1921, and the Santa Fe Springs field. These discoveries were of a different magnitude entirely, revealing some of the most concentrated petroleum deposits on the planet. By 1923, the Los Angeles Basin was producing nearly 20% of the world's total crude oil, a staggering output that temporarily made California the leading oil-producing state in the nation, surpassing Oklahoma and Texas. This eruption of black gold fundamentally reordered the regional economy. Agriculture, long the celebrated backbone of Southern California's prosperity, was quickly eclipsed. The value of oil extracted from the ground dwarfed the revenue from citrus groves. The landscape was radically altered as forests of wooden derricks sprouted overnight, transforming coastal plains and rolling hills into sprawling industrial zones. This new industry attracted a massive influx of capital, and a new class of migrant workers experienced drillers, tool pushers, and roughnecks from the oil fields of the Midwest. The immense revenue generated by oil taxes and royalties funded a new wave of civic development, providing the capital for roads, public buildings, and the expansion of the very port that had been fought for decades earlier. The boom also spurred the growth of ancillary industries, from refining and machine shops to the financial services required to manage the immense new wealth, cementing Los Angeles' identity not just as a sprawling suburb, but as a formidable industrial powerhouse. The origins of the Los Angeles film industry are rooted not in artistic ambition, but in a deliberate strategy to escape industrial monopoly. In the early 1900s, the nascent American film business was dominated by the Motion Picture Patents Company, MPPC, commonly known as the Edison Trust. Based in New Jersey, the trust held a near-total monopoly on film production and exhibition through its control of key patents, particularly those for cameras and projectors held by Thomas Edison. The MPPC aggressively used litigation and strong-arm tactics to suppress any independent filmmakers who attempted to operate outside its system. In response, these independence figures like Carl Laemmler, Adolf Zukor, and William Fox began searching for a new base of operations, one geographically and legally remote from the trust's reach. Southern California emerged as the ideal location for several practical reasons. Its distance from the East Coast made it difficult for the MPPC to enforce its patent claims. Furthermore, its proximity to the Mexican border offered a quick escape route for filmmakers needing to evade process servers or equipment seizures. The region's climate provided a crucial technical advantage. The consistent, year-round sunshine was essential for filming in an era of slow film stock and limited artificial lighting. The diverse local geography, offering deserts, mountains, and coastline within a short drive, allowed for the inexpensive replication of almost any setting in the world. The first permanent motion picture studio in Hollywood was established by the Nestor Film Company in 1911. Others rapidly followed, purchasing cheap land to build expansive studio lots. These independents, many of whom were Jewish immigrants, excluded from more established East Coast industries, quickly consolidated their power. They pioneered a new business model known as vertical integration. Unlike the trust, which primarily controlled patents, the new Hollywood studios controlled every phase of the business: production, making the films, distribution, marketing and delivering them, and exhibition, owning the theaters where they were shown. This system, perfected by studios like Paramount, Fox, and the future Universal and Warner Brothers, created a new, more powerful and efficient oligopoly. It operated on an industrial, factory-like model, utilizing long-term contracts to create a star system and mass-producing films that would dominate the global entertainment market for decades. The immense wealth generated by oil and motion pictures in the early 20th century, combined with the city's relentless population boom, fueled an unprecedented period of architectural experimentation. The new elite, disconnected from established East Coast traditions, sought a visual language that could define their new metropolis. This resulted in the widespread adoption of several distinct, yet often coexisting, architectural styles. The most pervasive of these was the Spanish colonial revival, an aesthetic heavily promoted by the city's boosters as a connection to a romanticized pre-American past. Popularized by Bertram Goodhue's designs for the 1915 Panama, California exposition in San Diego, this style was defined by its white stucco walls, low-pitched red tile roofs, wrought iron details, and enclosed courtyards. Architects like George Washington Smith and Wallace Neff perfected the form, creating grand estates that became the signature of Southern California's affluent suburbs. By the 1920s and 1930s, this historicist impulse was challenged by the rise of Art Deco, a style that celebrated the machine age, modernity, and glamour. Its aesthetic was characterized by strong vertical lines, geometric ornamentation like zigzags and chevrons, and the use of decorative terracotta and polished metals. This style found its most powerful expression in the city's new commercial and civic landmarks, such as the towering Los Angeles City Hall, the turquoise Eastern Columbia Building, and opulent movie palaces like the Wilton Theater, which visually embodied the city's forward-looking and industrial ambitions. Simultaneously, Los Angeles became a critical laboratory for architectural modernism, largely through the influence of European émigrés who found the region's climate and cultural openness receptive to their radical ideas. Richard Neutra and Rudolf Schindler, both of whom had connections to Frank Lloyd Wright and the European avant-garde, pioneered a distinct form of California modernism. Their work rejected historical ornamentation entirely, focusing instead on functionalism, clean lines, and the integration of indoor and outdoor space through the extensive use of glass and steel. Landmark structures like Neutra's Lovell Health House and Schindler's King's Road House were not just homes but manifestos, demonstrating new ways of living that would profoundly influence global architectural trends for the remainder of the century. While Los Angeles, in the early 20th century, possessed one of the world's most extensive interurban electric railway systems, the Pacific Electric's red cars, its destiny would be shaped by the internal combustion engine. The red car network, while expansive, was fundamentally a real estate development tool, designed by figures like Henry Huntington to sell subdivided land rather than to serve as a sustainable public utility. This system's financial vulnerabilities and fixed routes made it susceptible to the flexibility offered by the private automobile. By the 1920s, Los Angeles already had the highest per capita car ownership in the world, a trend that accelerated with the mass production of affordable vehicles like the Ford Model T. This widespread adoption created immense political pressure to shift public investment from rail to road infrastructure. The city's civic and business leaders, heavily influenced by the Automobile Club of Southern California, began advocating for a new type of roadway designed exclusively for high-speed motor traffic. The first major result of this advocacy was the Arroyo Seco Parkway, opened in 1940 and often cited as the first freeway in the American West. Its design principles, limited access, grade separation, and dedicated lanes became the template for future development. The true catalyst for regional transformation, however, was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This massive federal infrastructure project provided 90% of the funding for the construction of the interstate highway system, supercharging the creation of a vast freeway network across the Los Angeles basin. This network fundamentally reconfigured the region's geography, untethering residential and commercial development from the old rail corridors. It enabled the rise of massive, low-density suburban tracts built on former agricultural land, giving birth to modern suburban sprawl. Concurrently, the Pacific Electric system entered a period of terminal decline. While popular narratives often cite a conspiracy by General Motors and other corporations to dismantle public transit, the reality was a confluence of factors: decades of deferred maintenance, declining ridership in the face of automotive competition, and rising operational costs. The system's assets were sold in 1953, and its remaining lines were systematically replaced by bus routes, a process that concluded with the final red car run in 1961. This infrastructural pivot solidified the automobile's dominance, creating a new urban form and a distinct car culture, with the landscape increasingly defined by boulevards, drive-in businesses, and the ubiquitous single-family home with a two-car garage. The economic collapse following the 1929 stock market crash initially seemed a distant problem for Los Angeles, whose civic leaders boasted of a uniquely diversified economy immune to national downturns. This perception proved illusory. By 1931, the Depression's effects became catastrophic, crippling the region's key industries. The construction sector, a primary engine of the 1920s boom, completely seized up, and the once feverish real estate market collapsed. The city's oil industry faced plummeting prices, leading to widespread shutdowns of smaller drilling operations. Even Hollywood was not immune. Studio revenues dropped, forcing salary cuts and layoffs. The agricultural sector, which had been a pillar of the regional economy, was devastated by both falling prices and a massive influx of displaced farmers from the Dust Bowl states of Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. This migration of hundreds of thousands of so-called Okies created an enormous surplus of labor, driving agricultural wages down to subsistence levels and creating vast, impoverished migrant camps. The city's official response to this influx was overtly hostile. In 1936, the Los Angeles Police Department under Chief James E. Davis established the infamous Bum Blockade, stationing officers at state borders to turn back indigent migrants, an action later ruled unconstitutional. An even more systematic demographic purge was the Mexican repatriation program. Between 1929 and 1936, county and federal officials orchestrated the removal of an estimated 400 people of Mexican descent from Southern California, including a significant number of American-born citizens who were unlawfully deported. This mass displacement was framed as a voluntary relief measure, but it was often carried out through coercion and intimidation. The extreme economic hardship also fueled significant labor unrest and political radicalism. The long-dominant anti-union stance of the city's elite, enforced by the LAPD's Red Squad, was challenged by a wave of strikes. The 1934 West Coast waterfront strike paralyzed the port of Los Angeles, while agricultural workers in the surrounding valleys, often organized by communist-affiliated unions, engaged in violent and protracted labor disputes. The political landscape was similarly upended by Upton Sinclair's 1934 gubernatorial campaign and his End Poverty in California EPIC movement, a socialist platform that, while ultimately unsuccessful, mobilized an unprecedented coalition of the unemployed and working poor, permanently shifting the region's political discourse to the left. The term Dust Bowl migration refers to a specific demographic movement during the 1930s, driven by an ecological and economic catastrophe in the southern Great Plains. A prolonged drought, beginning in 1930, combined with decades of unsustainable farming practices, specifically the deep ploughing of native grasslands for wheat production, left topsoil exposed and vulnerable. When severe windstorms, known as black blizzards, swept across the region, they stripped away millions of tons of arid soil, rendering vast agricultural areas uninhabitable. This disaster, centered in the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas and extending into Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, displaced over 500,000 people. While not all became migrants, an estimated 300 to 400 made their way to California, traveling in dilapidated automobiles along Route 66. These migrants were ethnically and culturally distinct from previous waves of laborers. They were overwhelmingly white, native-born, Protestant families who had previously been landowners or tenant farmers, not itinerant workers. Their arrival fundamentally altered the composition of California's agricultural labor force, which had historically been dominated by Mexican, Filipino, and other immigrant groups. This massive influx created an unprecedented labor surplus, which was systematically exploited by California's large-scale agribusinesses, organized under entities like the Associated Farmers of California. These powerful growers' associations actively suppressed wages and used their political influence to crush any attempts at unionization among the new arrivals. The migrants were forced into a cycle of seasonal labor, living in makeshift encampments or Hoovervilles, often on the fringes of agricultural towns. These camps, vividly documented by Farm Security Administration photographers like Dorothea Lange, were characterized by extreme poverty and a lack of sanitation. The reception from established Californians was one of open hostility. The pejorative term Okie was applied indiscriminately to all migrants from the Dust Bowl states, branding them as ignorant, unclean, and a drain on public resources. This social ostracism, combined with their desperate economic situation, created a distinct and marginalized white underclass. Unlike the state's non-white populations, who were segregated by law, the Okies were segregated by class and culture, a new phenomenon that reshaped the state's social and political landscape for generations. The entry of the United States into World War II initiated an economic and demographic transformation in Los Angeles of unparalleled scale and speed, permanently converting the region into a global center for industrial production. While a significant aviation industry, including firms like Douglas, Lockheed, and North American Aviation, had already been established, the war precipitated an unprecedented infusion of federal capital. Between 1941 and 1945, over $11 billion in federal defense contracts flowed into California, with the vast majority concentrated in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. This investment catalyzed the explosive growth of what became known as the Big Four aerospace companies. Douglas Aircraft's facilities in Santa Monica and Long Beach became massive production centers, churning out tens of thousands of C-47 Skytrain transport planes. Lockheed in Burbank focused on advanced fighters, including the iconic P-38 Lightning, while North American Aviation in Inglewood produced the P-51 Mustang and the B-25 Mitchell bomber. The scale of this manufacturing effort was immense. By 1943, 1 in 8 aircraft produced in the United States was assembled in a Los Angeles area factory. The wartime boom was not confined to aviation. The Port of Los Angeles became a critical hub for shipbuilding. The California Shipbuilding Corporation, or CalShip, established on Terminal Island, employed over 40 workers at its peak, and utilized assembly line techniques to produce 467 Liberty and Victory ships. This industrial mobilization required a workforce far larger than the local population could provide, triggering a second Great Migration to Southern California, distinct from the Dust Bowl influx of the previous decade. Over 1 million people moved to the region to work in defense plants. This new wave of migrants was more geographically and ethnically diverse, including large numbers of African Americans from the rural South, who found industrial employment opportunities previously denied to them. The wartime labor shortage also led to the mass entry of women into the industrial workforce, embodied by the Rosie the Riveter archetype. This rapid demographic shift, however, created significant social friction. The city suffered from acute housing shortages, and racial tensions escalated, culminating in events like the 1943 Zoot Suit riots, a series of clashes between white servicemen and Mexican-American youths. Simultaneously, the war provided the pretext for one of the nation's most egregious civil liberties violations: the forced removal and incarceration of over 120 Japanese Americans, a significant portion of whom were from Los Angeles County, under Executive Order 9066. The industrial infrastructure built during these 4 years was not dismantled after the war. It became the foundation of the region's post-war aerospace and technology economy. The Zoot Suit riots of June 1943 were the culmination of simmering racial and social animosities, exacerbated by the unique pressures of the wartime environment in Los Angeles. The conflict was centered on the Zoot Suit itself, a style of clothing adopted by a subculture of Mexican-American, African-American, and Filipino youths known as pachucos, characterized by high-waisted, wide-legged trousers, a long coat with wide lapels, and a fedora. The suit was a symbol of cultural identity and defiance. In a time of wartime rationing, the suit's profligate use of fabric was portrayed by the mainstream press, particularly the Hearst-owned newspapers, as unpatriotic and delinquent. A moral panic was systematically constructed around the figure of the Pachuco, who was depicted as a dangerous gang member and a threat to social order. This media campaign laid the groundwork for the violence to come. The immediate precursor to the riots was the 1942 Sleepy Lagoon murder trial. Following the death of a young man, Jose Gallardo Diaz, the LAPD conducted a mass arrest of over 600 Mexican-American youths. 17 were ultimately indicted for murder on flimsy evidence in a trial marked by extreme judicial bias. The defendants were not allowed to change their clothes or cut their hair, reinforcing the jury's prejudice. Their convictions, though later overturned on appeal, solidified the public perception of Mexican-American youth as inherently criminal. The riots began on June 3, 1943, following a confrontation between a group of US sailors and some Pachucos. In the following days, the conflict escalated dramatically. Mobs of servicemen, primarily sailors and Marines, commandeered taxicabs and roamed through downtown Los Angeles and East Los Angeles, seeking out and brutally attacking anyone wearing a zoot suit. They beat the youths with clubs, stripped them of their clothes, and burned the suits in the streets. The Los Angeles Police Department's response was notoriously one-sided. Police officers often followed the mobs, arresting the bloodied victims for vagrancy while allowing their attackers to disperse. The violence continued for nearly a week until senior military officials, fearing a complete breakdown of order, declared downtown Los Angeles off-limits to all military personnel. In the immediate aftermath, the Los Angeles City Council passed an ordinance banning the wearing of zoot suits. An investigative committee appointed by Governor Earl Warren, led by Bishop Joseph McGuckin, later concluded that the riots were unequivocally caused by racial prejudice, a finding that city officials publicly rejected. The suburbanization of Los Angeles after 1945 was not a gradual evolution, but a state-sponsored and industrially executed demographic revolution. The primary catalyst was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill. Its most transformative provision was not educational benefits, but federally guaranteed, low-interest, zero-down payment home loans for veterans, administered by the Veterans Administration (VA). This financial instrument suddenly made home ownership accessible to millions of returning servicemen who lacked the capital for traditional mortgages. The result was an explosion in housing demand that the existing urban infrastructure could not meet. This demand was met by a new model of industrial-scale residential construction. Developers like Fritz Burns, Henry J. Kaiser, and the builders of Lakewood Park applied mass production techniques honed in wartime factories directly to home building. They purchased vast tracts of inexpensive agricultural land, primarily in the San Fernando Valley and the plains of southern Los Angeles County. Construction was rationalized into a streamlined assembly line process. Bulldozers would level a tract, concrete slab foundations were poured in sequence, and specialized, non-unionized crews moved from house to house, each performing a single repetitive task: framing, roofing, wiring, plumbing. This method allowed for the construction of thousands of standardized single-family homes at unprecedented speed and low cost. The Lakewood Park development, which began in 1950, stands as the archetype. Its developers built over 17,500 houses in less than 3 years, creating an instant city. However, this suburban expansion was built on a foundation of systematic racial exclusion. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, which insured many of the loans that financed these developments, institutionalized segregation through its underwriting manuals. The FHA explicitly redlined neighborhoods with minority residents, deeming them hazardous for investment and refusing to insure mortgages there. Furthermore, the agency actively encouraged the use of racially restrictive covenants in new suburban tracts, making it a condition for developers to receive federal loan guarantees. These covenants were legally binding clauses in property deeds that prohibited the sale or rental of homes to non-whites. Although the Supreme Court ruled such covenants unenforceable in Shelley v. Kramer in 1948, the FHA and private developers continued to use them extra-legally, ensuring that these new federally subsidized communities were almost exclusively white. This combination of VA financing, FHA policy, and industrial construction methods created the modern Los Angeles suburb, a sprawling, physically homogeneous, and racially segregated landscape. The construction of the Los Angeles freeway system, while often perceived as an organic response to the automobile, was a centrally planned, federally funded project that fundamentally re-engineered the region's social and physical landscape. The intellectual groundwork was laid in the 1930s with parkway designs, but the true catalyst was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This legislation, framed as a Cold War necessity under the title National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, committed the federal government to paying 90% of the cost for a national network of high-speed, limited-access roads. For Southern California, this infusion of federal capital was transformative, turning ambitious local plans into concrete and steel reality. The California Division of Highways, wielding immense power through the principles of eminent domain, began a massive program of land acquisition and construction. The process was inherently destructive. Route planning was not a neutral technical exercise. Engineers often targeted the path of least political and economic resistance, which invariably led through the heart of established, low-income minority communities. Thousands of homes, businesses, and community institutions were condemned and demolished. The East Los Angeles Interchange, a sprawling confluence of multiple freeways, required the displacement of thousands of residents from the predominantly Latino neighborhood of Boyle Heights, effectively vivisecting the community. Similarly, the construction of the Santa Monica Freeway, Interstate 10, in the early 1960s deliberately cut through the West Adams district, destroying Sugar Hill, a prosperous African-American enclave, and displacing its residents. This practice of slum clearance via freeway construction served as a tool of urban renewal, reinforcing the patterns of racial segregation established by earlier housing policies. The freeways became new, impassable borders, physically isolating minority neighborhoods from the rapidly expanding, predominantly white suburbs. While they enabled unprecedented individual mobility for a new generation of suburban commuters, they simultaneously dismantled the walkable, mixed-use urban fabric of older communities. The immense scale of the project created a new topography of concrete rivers, overpasses, and multi-level interchanges, a landscape engineered for the automobile at the direct expense of the communities it bisected. The freeway system was thus a dual legacy, an engine of post-war economic expansion and suburban growth, and a powerful instrument of social engineering that inscribed racial and economic inequality directly onto the geography of the city. The post-war economy of Southern California was fundamentally reshaped by the geopolitical realities of the Cold War, which transformed the region's established aviation sector into the epicenter of America's aerospace and defense industry. This was not a market-driven development, but a direct consequence of massive, sustained federal investment. Following the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957, the ensuing space race and arms race channeled billions of dollars from the Department of Defense and the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, into a concentrated cluster of Southern California corporations. Companies that had prospered during World War II, such as Lockheed in Burbank, Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica and Long Beach, and North American Aviation in Downey, pivoted from mass-producing propeller planes to developing next-generation jet fighters, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and spacecraft. This industrial complex was characterized by high-risk, high-cost research and development entirely underwritten by federal contracts. Lockheed's secretive Skunk Works division, for example, produced iconic Cold War aircraft like the U-2 and SR-71 Blackbird spy planes. North American Aviation was awarded the prime contracts for the Apollo Command and Service modules, the nerve center and life support system for the moon missions. The South Bay region became a dense hub of innovation, with firms like Hughes Aircraft pioneering missile guidance systems and Northrop developing advanced military aircraft. This corporate ecosystem was inextricably linked with the region's elite academic institutions. The California Institute of Technology, Caltech, managed the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, in Pasadena for NASA, which became the nation's primary center for robotic interplanetary exploration, responsible for the Mariner, Viking, and Voyager missions. In Santa Monica, the RAND Corporation, a non-profit global policy think tank spun off from Douglas Aircraft, provided high-level strategic analysis for the U.S. Air Force, shaping nuclear deterrence policy and Cold War doctrine. This military-industrial academic complex became the region's dominant economic engine, creating hundreds of thousands of high-wage jobs for engineers, scientists, and technicians, and cementing Southern California's identity as a hub of technological innovation financed almost entirely by the imperatives of national security. The civil rights movement in Los Angeles during the early 1960s confronted a distinct form of systemic inequality, not the de jure segregation of the American South, but a deeply entrenched de facto segregation. The city's African-American population, which had grown exponentially during the Second Great Migration, was geographically contained in south-central Los Angeles by a combination of racially restrictive covenants, redlining by the Federal Housing Administration, and discriminatory real estate practices. This residential segregation was compounded by systemic employment discrimination, which locked black workers out of the high-wage aerospace and manufacturing sectors, and educational inequality, with schools in minority neighborhoods being chronically underfunded and overcrowded. The political landscape offered little recourse. A significant victory, the Rumford Fair Housing Act of 1963, which banned racial discrimination in housing, was decisively overturned by California voters in November 1964 via Proposition 14. This act was a profound psychological and political blow, signaling that the state's white majority was actively opposed to racial integration. The most acute source of tension was the relationship with the Los Angeles Police Department, under the command of Chief William H. Parker. Parker had professionalized the force, but also instilled a militaristic, aggressive policing style that disproportionately targeted minority communities. His public statements often carried racist undertones, and the LAPD, which was overwhelmingly white, operated with near impunity in black neighborhoods, leading to a pervasive sense of injustice, fueled by constant reports of police brutality and harassment. The breaking point came on August 11, 1965. The arrest of Marquette Fry, a 21-year-old African-American man, by a white California Highway Patrol officer for suspicion of drunk driving in the Watts neighborhood escalated into a physical confrontation involving Fry's family and a growing crowd. The arrival of LAPD reinforcements and the spread of rumors, including a false report that police had kicked a pregnant woman, ignited the long-simmering resentment. The ensuing 6 days of civil unrest, known as the Watts Rebellion, were not a chaotic riot, but a targeted uprising against symbols of oppression. Businesses with reputations for exploiting local residents were looted and burned, while many black-owned establishments and public buildings were spared. The scale of the rebellion overwhelmed local law enforcement, necessitating the deployment of nearly 14 California Army National Guard troops to restore order. The final statistics were stark. 34 people killed, over 10 injured, nearly 40 arrested, and over $40 million in property damage. The subsequent investigation by the McCone Commission identified the root causes in the socio-economic conditions: unemployment, inadequate schooling, and systemic discrimination, but its recommendations for reform were largely unimplemented, leaving the deep-seated grievances that ignited the rebellion to fester for decades. The Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, erupted in Los Angeles during the late 1960s, not as a singular event, but as a coalescence of long-standing grievances against systemic discrimination in education, politics, and law enforcement. Its epicenter was the segregated barrios of East Los Angeles, where the Mexican-American population faced profound institutional neglect. Public schools in the area were characterized by dilapidated facilities, overcrowded classrooms, and a curriculum that ignored Mexican-American history and culture. High dropout rates were normalized by a school system that actively practiced vocational tracking, steering students towards manual labor and away from higher education. This educational inequity became the primary catalyst for organized protest. A crucial ideological shift was the embrace of the term Chicano, a self-identifying political label that rejected the assimilationist aims of the older Mexican-American generation and asserted a proud identity rooted in indigenous ancestry and a shared history and resistance. This new consciousness was fostered by community organizations like the Brown Berets, a youth group modeled on the Black Panthers that focused on community defense and political action. The most dramatic manifestation of this new activism occurred in March 1968 with the East LA walkouts or blowouts. Over several days, more than 15 students from high schools including Garfield, Roosevelt, Lincoln, and Wilson walked out of their classes in a coordinated protest. The protests, organized by students and supported by community activists and teacher Sal Castro, presented the school board with a list of concrete demands: bilingual and bicultural education, the hiring of more Mexican-American teachers and administrators, and curriculum reforms to include Chicano history. The official response was punitive, involving a heavy police presence and the arrest of 13 organizers, including Castro, on conspiracy charges. The movement reached its zenith on August 29, 1970, with the National Chicano Moratorium March. An estimated 20 to 30 people marched through East Los Angeles to protest the disproportionately high casualty rates of Chicano soldiers in the Vietnam War. The peaceful demonstration ended tragically when Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies moved in to disperse the crowd, leading to clashes. During the chaos, deputies fired a tear gas projectile into the Silver Dollar Bar, killing the prominent journalist Ruben Salazar. Salazar's death galvanized the movement, turning him into a martyr, and further exposing the deep-seated antagonism between law enforcement and the Chicano community. While the immediate aftermath was marked by conflict, the long-term legacy of the movement was the development of lasting political power, the establishment of Chicano studies departments in universities, and a fundamental shift in the political and cultural identity of the city's largest ethnic group. Los Angeles in the mid-1960s became a primary locus for a distinct strain of American counterculture, one less overtly political than its Bay Area counterpart, and more deeply intertwined with the entertainment and art industries. The geographical heart of this movement was the Sunset Strip, a mile-and-a-half stretch of unincorporated county land that became a haven for nightclubs and music venues. Establishments like the Whiskey A Go-Go, which opened in 1964, the Roxy, and Pandora's Box became incubators for a new sound. It was here that folk music, influenced by Bob Dylan, merged with rock and roll to create the folk rock genre, pioneered by bands like the Byrds. The scene quickly evolved to embrace psychedelic rock, with local bands such as The Doors, Love, and Buffalo Springfield creating a uniquely LA sound that was both cerebral and commercially viable. The residential hub for this musical explosion was Laurel Canyon, whose rustic isolation within the city provided a communal living space for musicians like Joni Mitchell, Frank Zappa, and members of the Mamas, the Papas. Parallel to the music scene, a significant visual art movement, known as the Cool School, was challenging the dominance of New York's abstract expressionism. The Ferris Gallery, run by Walter Hopps and Irving Blum, was its primary showcase, championing artists like Ed Ruscha, whose deadpan depictions of LA iconography redefined pop art, and Ed Kienholz, whose large-scale assemblage installations offered searing social critiques. This artistic foment was not without conflict. The influx of young people onto the Strip created friction with local business owners and law enforcement. In November 1966, this tension erupted into the Sunset Strip curfew riots, after authorities began enforcing a strict 10 p.m. curfew and loitering laws targeting the youth who frequented the clubs. The protests, famously immortalized in Buffalo Springfield's song For What It's Worth, were a direct clash between the burgeoning youth culture and the city's conservative establishment. Beyond the Strip, the counterculture manifested in other forms, such as the rise of the underground press, with the Los Angeles Free Press becoming one of the most influential alternative newspapers in the country. This confluence of music, art, and generational rebellion defined a specific moment where Los Angeles, for a time, became the creative and social frontier of a new, dissident American culture. The 1980s marked a period of profound and painful economic restructuring for Los Angeles, dismantling the industrial base that had anchored its economy since World War II. This process of deindustrialization was not a gradual decline, but a rapid series of plant closures that decimated the region's high-wage, blue-collar employment sector. Between the late 1970s and early 1990s, Los Angeles County lost its entire automobile and tire manufacturing industry. Major facilities such as the General Motors assembly plant in Southgate, the Ford plant in Pico Rivera, and tire factories for Goodyear, Firestone, and Uniroyal all ceased operations. These closures were part of a national trend driven by increased foreign competition, particularly from Japan, and corporate strategies focused on relocating production to lower-cost regions in the Sun Belt or overseas. The steel industry followed a similar trajectory, with Bethlehem Steel's Vernon plant, a major employer, shutting down in 1982. The cumulative effect was the loss of tens of thousands of stable, unionized jobs that had provided a pathway to the middle class for generations of Angelenos, disproportionately affecting African American and Latino workers who were heavily concentrated in these industries. Concurrent with this industrial collapse was the rise of a new, bifurcated service economy. On one end, high-wage sectors in finance, insurance, and real estate, FIRE, along with entertainment and the burgeoning high-tech and aerospace design industries, expanded significantly. Downtown Los Angeles saw a skyscraper boom, symbolizing this shift toward a post-industrial corporate headquarters economy. On the other end, low-wage service jobs in hospitality, retail, garment manufacturing, and building maintenance proliferated. These positions were typically non-union, offered few benefits, and were increasingly filled by a growing immigrant labor force from Mexico and Central America. This economic polarization created a widening chasm between the affluent professionals in the new growth sectors and the displaced industrial workers and new service employees. The spatial consequences were stark. Wealth concentrated in West Side communities and newly developing suburbs, while poverty became more deeply entrenched in the deindustrialized zones of South Central and East Los Angeles. The decline of the manufacturing tax base eroded public services in working-class communities, leading to underfunded schools and decaying infrastructure, further exacerbating the cycle of poverty and setting the stage for the social crises of the following decade. The Games of the '23 Olympiad, held in Los Angeles in 1984, were a watershed moment, fundamentally reshaping the financial and operational model of the modern Olympic movement. Awarded the Games by default after Tehran, its only competitor, withdrew its bid in 1978. Los Angeles inherited a franchise tainted by the massive debt incurred by Montreal in 1976 and the politically charged boycotts of that year and 1980. LLA. City voters had passed a charter amendment prohibiting the use of public funds for the event, forcing a radical new approach. The solution came from the Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee, LAUC, a private entity led by businessman Peter Ueberroth. This marked the first time in history that the Olympic Games were financed entirely by the private sector. Ueberroth's model was built on two core principles: leveraging existing infrastructure and securing unprecedented levels of corporate sponsorship. Instead of constructing a new Olympic park, the LAOOC utilized a vast network of pre-existing venues, including the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum and Rose Bowl, which had been used in the 1932 Games, along with facilities at UCLA and USC. This strategy drastically reduced capital expenditure. The committee also created a tiered system of exclusive corporate sponsorships, with companies like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Fujifilm paying substantial fees to become the official sponsor in their product category. This commercialization, while controversial at the time, proved immensely successful. Geopolitically, the Games were impacted by the Soviet Union's decision to lead a 14-nation Eastern Bloc boycott, a clear retaliation for the American-led boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. While this removed many top-tier athletes from competition, it did little to dampen the event's success. The Games were a triumph of logistics and branding, characterized by a vibrant visual identity designed by Deborah Sussman and John Jerde, and powered by an enormous core of citizen volunteers. The financial outcome was stunning. The LAUC generated a surplus of over $232 million, a figure that stood in stark contrast to the deficits of previous games. This profit was used to create the LA84 Foundation, an endowment dedicated to supporting youth sports in Southern California. The 1984 Olympics not only restored the financial viability of the Olympic movement, but also served as a massive public relations victory for Los Angeles, projecting a new image of glamour, efficiency, and private sector ingenuity onto the world stage. The civil unrest that engulfed Los Angeles in the spring of 1992 was the direct result of the acquittal of 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers in the videotaped beating of motorist Rodney King. On April 29, 1992, a jury in Simi Valley, a predominantly white suburb in Ventura County, to which the trial had been moved, found the officers not guilty on almost all charges. The verdict was announced shortly after 3:00 p.m. Within hours, the intersection of Florence and Normandy Avenues in south-central Los Angeles became the flashpoint for a violent reaction. The initial response was chaotic and leaderless, culminating in the assault on truck driver Reginald Denny, which was captured by news helicopters and broadcast live, graphically illustrating the breakdown of civil order. the Los Angeles Police Department's response was critically delayed and disorganized. Police Chief Daryl Gates was attending a political fundraiser in Brentwood at the time the verdict was announced, and the initial violence erupted, and a coherent command structure failed to materialize for several crucial hours. The initial police retreat from the Florence and Normandy intersection effectively ceded control of the streets to the growing crowds. The unrest rapidly escalated from targeted assaults to widespread looting and arson, which was not confined to South Central. The violence spread to Koreatown, Mid-Wilshire, Pico Union, and parts of the San Fernando Valley. Koreatown, in particular, became a significant theater of conflict. Tensions between the African American and Korean American communities, already high following the light sentence given to a Korean store owner for the killing of teenager Latasha Harlins a year prior, exploded as Korean-owned businesses were systematically targeted. In the absence of a police presence, many Korean merchants armed themselves to defend their property, leading to televised firefights. The scale of the event was immense. Over the course of 6 days, more than 63 people were killed. Over 300 were injured, and more than 120 were arrested. The Los Angeles Fire Department responded to nearly 80 fire-related calls, with over 100 buildings destroyed by arson. Property damage was estimated to be over $1 billion. Order was only restored after the deployment of approximately 13,500 troops, including the California National Guard, U.S. Army soldiers from Fort Ord, and U.S. Marines from Camp Pendleton, marking one of the largest domestic military deployments in modern American history. At 4:31 a.m. on January 17, 1994, the San Fernando Valley was violently shaken by a moment-magnitude 6.7 earthquake. Unlike previous seismic events attributed to the well-known San Andreas Fault, the Northridge earthquake originated from a previously unmapped blind thrust fault located approximately 11 miles beneath the community of Reseda. This type of fault, which does not rupture the surface, releases energy upwards with immense force, and its location directly beneath a densely populated urban area resulted in some of the strongest ground motions ever instrumentally recorded in North America. The resulting infrastructure failure was catastrophic and immediate. Several critical freeway interchanges, including the junction of the Golden State Freeway, I-5, and the Antelope Valley Freeway, SR-14, and a section of the Santa Monica Freeway, I-10, at La Cienega Boulevard, collapsed completely, severing the region's primary transportation arteries. The structural damage to buildings was widespread, most notably the collapse of the Northridge Meadows apartment complex, where 16 residents died, exposing the fatal vulnerabilities of soft-story wood-frame construction. Other significant collapses included the Kaiser Permanente office building in Granada Hills and the Bullock's department store at the Northridge Fashion Center. The human and economic toll was severe. The earthquake was responsible for at least 57 fatalities, over 90 injuries, and an estimated $20 billion in damages, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in United States history at the time. The event served as a critical, albeit devastating, engineering laboratory. It exposed systemic weaknesses in modern construction, particularly in non-ductile reinforced concrete columns and welded steel frame buildings, which were previously thought to be seismically sound but suffered brittle fractures. In the aftermath, the state of California passed landmark legislation mandating the seismic evaluation and retrofitting of hospitals and other critical facilities. Building codes were substantially revised to account for the intense vertical ground accelerations observed during the quake. The Northridge earthquake was a pivotal event that shifted the focus of seismology from known surface faults to the hidden dangers of blind thrust faults beneath urban centers, forcing a fundamental reassessment of seismic risk and engineering practices in Southern California and worldwide.